Hello and welcome to the final Intra Amsterdam virtual festival session of the day. I'd like to say a huge thanks to Rachel Hardwick and Joe Leach for their brilliant talks earlier. So we are really excited for our next talk, which is from a speaker who spoke at the very first ever Interact back in 2014. He is the author of Living in Information, Responsible Design for Digital Places and co-author of the Polar Bear book, Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond. And let's be honest, someone that doesn't really need an introduction, Jorge Arango. A massive thank you for getting up very early to present, as it's 7 a.m. where you are now. As always, please do get involved and say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure you've switched your chat settings to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there are any audio issues or anything like that, and we'll try and get things fixed for you ASAP. Please do ask Jorge lots of questions using the Q&A box, and I will ask these to him at the very end, and I'll try and get through as many as I can. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jorge to kick things off for his talk titled The Strategic Designer.
Thank you. So those of you who were able to tune in to Joe's presentation before this one now know about jobs to be done theory. And if you weren't able to tune in and you don't know what I'm talking about, so jobs to be done theory is an idea that has become popular in the business world, I would say over the last decade and a half, but I don't keep track of such things. And what it says is that people don't buy, in essence, I'm going to summarize really high level. In essence, it says that people don't buy products and services for the products and services themselves per se. They buy them for what these things can do for them, right? So the classic way of introducing this is to say that people don't buy a drill because they want a drill. They buy a drill because they want a hole in the wall. And as Joe points out, ultimately, they don't really even want a hole in the wall. What they want is to be able to hang a picture. And jobs to be done is an example of reframing, of taking something that we understand and changing how we look at it. And by reframing, we can understand things differently, and we can get more value out of them. Because if we understand a drill not as just drill, but as a means to doing certain things, then we can start thinking beyond the drill, right? We can start thinking about other ways that we can hang pictures on the wall, as the case might be. So reframing is incredibly powerful. And the objective of this presentation is to reframe how you think about design. Because I think that we have not been getting as much value from design as we can. And by the end of this hour, you should have an understanding maybe at a high level about what business strategy is and how design can help in making strategic decisions. I believe very strongly that if you take these principles seriously, you will be a more valuable designer if you're a designer. And if you have a design team, you will get more value out of your design team. And I believe that that is the case because in my experience, both as a design consultant and a design teacher, I find that these days, design is seen in many organizations as an implementation function. That is a role within the organization that exists to make tangible ideas and decisions that have been made elsewhere. And I think that that undervalues design, frankly. Design can contribute a lot more. And it also has the effect that designers are not seen as peers to stakeholders in organizations. Andy Budd has this quip that he says that I find is spot on in this regard. He says that design has a seat at the table, but more often than not, it's a high chair, and we're expected to sit there quietly playing with our crayons. And I think it is cheeky, of course, but it's not far from the truth. I've spoken with people in design teams in organizations that have this very long list of things that they need to implement, and they've had little, if any, say in choosing what those things are going to be. And I think that it's a situation in which both designers and the organization are losing out. And it's worth acknowledging that this is not because anyone wants to put designers down intentionally or has any kind of ill feelings towards designers. It's because design is a relatively new function to organizations. Traditionally, the function of design has been performed by outside consultants. And if you look at the history of design in the 20th century, where it became a discipline, like an acknowledged discipline, the people that you think about, like Raymond Loewy, Charles Andre Eames, Helmut Eschlinger, folks like that, they were all consultants or heads of agencies that were brought into an organization to solve particular problems. This idea that design is an organ within the organization is relatively new. And a lot of folks perceive design as being about form making, about making things more usable, more accessible, more engaging, right? And that translates to in many people's minds, to the people who are going to be basically painting the interfaces through which our customers, our users interact with our services. And like I said, I believe that this perception undervalues design, because design brings to the table much more than just crayons. And for us as designers to be able to come to the table and engage with other stakeholders in a meaningful way, it is imperative that we understand where those folks are coming from. And especially when you're talking about high-level decisions, that implies that you need to be able to understand strategy and what drives a business strategy. So what do we mean by strategy? I must first acknowledge that this is a subject that has taken me a while to come to grips with. And what I'm going to be relaying to you in this presentation is my understanding at this point from studying the subject and practicing it as a consultant. But it's not an understanding that has emerged naturally from my interactions with other folks in the business world. I had to actually go out and search out the books and the people who have been doing work in this area. And that is because the term strategy is often used very casually to mean things that are not really strategy. I often see people say things like, our strategy is to be the low-cost provider, for example. And that, I don't think that that is a strategy. That is an aspiration. And you will often hear the term used colloquially to talk about your people's plans for doing something. So it's a little muddled, our understanding of strategy. And one book that has been very helpful to me in drawing boundaries around the concept of design is by a consultant called Richard Rummelt. And the book is called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And in that book, he talks about strategy as a cohesive response to important challenges. And I think that is a closer approximation to what we mean here. What types of challenges is something that is worth digging into. And for that, I'm going to try to unpack the nature of business. So if you think about business, there are a few factors that describe what a business is and does. All right. So the first thing to think about is that businesses are productive. And by productive, I mean the function of a business is to add value in some area of the world that that people are willing to pay for, basically. So you take raw materials, and out the other end comes something that people find valuable in their lives, and therefore are willing to give you money for. The way that Peter Drucker puts it, he says that, or he said, he's dead now, but he said that the purpose of a business is to create a customer. And I think that it's important to acknowledge the productive nature of business. So we start there. The second characteristic of business that is important to be mindful of is that business is dynamic. And by this, I mean that it never stands still. So let's say that you have created a new product that turns raw materials into something that people find valuable, and you are finding traction in the marketplace. The conditions that led to that transformation, that productive transformation, are not going to be there for long. The market is going to move on. Some competitor is going to come along and invent a better way of doing it. The customers might tire of your product, or their need might go away. And this requires that businesses be constantly adjusting their approach to adding value. So that's what I mean by dynamic. The third characteristic that is important to point out here is that businesses are complex. I've been talking about this very high-level example of taking raw materials and transforming them into something of value. And in one of the most famous books, probably the most famous books about economics, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith opens that book with an example of a pin factory. And he talks about how being thoughtful about the way that pins are manufactured can lead to greater efficiencies. And it's a very linear process that he describes for taking raw materials in one end and producing a product of value at the other end. The reality is much more complicated than that. We have providers who supply us with those raw materials. Those providers have incentives and constraints of their own. We have human factors that go into managing a business. We have the infrastructure of modern life, So this thing that we're doing now, communicating remotely over the internet, we have regulations, right? So we live in societies that place constraints on what a business can and cannot do. And all of these things make managing a business very complex. It's not the sort of problem for which there are easy answers. In fact, it's hard to even sometimes define what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And in acknowledging this dynamic and complex nature of business, the thing to keep in mind is that the people who manage these organizations need to make choices. And they are asked to make choices at pretty much every juncture in their tenure managing the business. And strategy, as I understand it, is primarily about decision making. Michael Porter, who is one of the most influential folks in the strategy world, says that strategy is choice. And he has this famous saying, he says that strategy is saying no to certain kinds of things, which, if you think about it, is kind of at the core of what decision making is in a business context. In choosing one thing, you have to say no to a lot of other things. And that can be hard, especially when all of those things seem to be equally attractive. So decision making is hugely important. And what we want to do as we make decisions in this dynamic and complex context that we're operating in is that we want to move forward proactively, not reactively. What do I mean by that? So it's relatively easy to make choices when you are faced with a challenge, with a clear challenge, let's say, from a competitor. So a new company, a new entrant into the market releases a product or a service that competes directly with you. All of a sudden you are put on the defensive and your challenge has been clearly articulated for you. And you have to meet that challenge. And in responding to that, you are acting reactively. And it's quite another thing to act proactively, to make decisions about how you're going to move forward that take into consideration things like new entrants into the market or new ways in which people are finding ways of doing the thing that your product does for them. It's very different to do that proactively than it is to do it reactively. But in either case, what we want to do is we want to marshal our resources in a coherent effort towards a desired state. So I'm going to repeat that because that's core to my understanding of strategy. And I'm going to write them out here, what the key points there. So we want to marshal our resources. What do we mean by that? So resources are things like the money that we have in the bank, right? We have a certain amount of money that we can invest in things. We have talent in our organizations. They have different skills, different abilities. We have, maybe we have intellectual property. We have particular approaches, particular ways of doing things. So those are all resources. And we want to marshal resources. And we want to marshal resources in a coherent effort. What do we mean by that? So we're going to be using these resources in particular ways. We're going to be deploying them. And what we want to do is we want to deploy them in such a way that we move things forward, that we do so in a focused way, so that if we take an initiative um, with a brand that we own, and in another part of the organization, we are developing a new product, doing research to develop a new product, we want to make sure that those two things are in alignment and that they're helping move things in a similar direction. So we want to be focused. We want to move things forward in a coherent way. And we're moving forward towards a desired state. And what I mean by that is our goal. So it might be that we want to gain a particular market share in our industry. We've entered a new geography and we want to gain a certain percentage of market share in that geography. That is a desired state. So we're not the market leader now. After this intervention, we're going to be the market leader, or we're going to have X percentage of the market. So we want to marshal resources in a coherent effort towards a desired state. The word strategy has roots in military efforts. So it comes from Greek, the original word, and I can't speak Greek, but the original word is strategos. I think that is how it's pronounced, but it basically means generalship. So the people who organize the efforts of the army, right? So they are marshaling the resources in a coherent effort towards a desired state. All right, so I realize that this is a bit high level, and you may be wondering, well, exactly how do we marshal our efforts towards marshal our resources in a coherent effort towards a desired state? And here is useful for us to look at a framework that comes from a book called Playing to Win. And this is one of my favorite books on strategy. It was written by Roger Martin and A.G. Lafley. I think it's A.G. Roger Martin was the dean of the Rotman School of Business in Toronto. And A.G. Lafley was the CEO of Procter & Gamble. And they jointly developed this framework that they used to manage PG. And this is a framework that I find useful for understanding strategic decision making. So they call their model an integrated cascade of choices. So remember that I told you that strategy is about making decisions, right? And making choices. And they break this down into a very particular set of decisions that you make when you're defining a strategy. And I'm going to draw them out here. So the first set of choices has to do with what they call a winning aspiration. And by that, they mean, what is your goal? What are you trying to do? Like we said, like maybe you are entering a new geography and you want to be the market leader in that geography for your particular widget that you sell. That is a winning aspiration. And note the language, right? Like this, it does sound a little zero sum. The name of the book is Playing to Win. So they're literally talking about like, what is your strategy to winning in the market? And it all starts with understanding what you're trying to win at. That's what they call a winning aspiration. The second level in the cascade, the second thing that that managers need to think about when they are thinking about their strategy is where the company will play. I'm going to draw the question marks here so that you remember that these are questions. So where will the company play? And by this, they mean things like what geographies. Like I said, maybe you have entered the Brazilian market, and you have determined that you you want to appeal to a particular consumer segment. So your product is aimed at women between 18 and 34 years old. That is the primary consumer segment. Where you will play also entails things like what channels are you going to use to bring the product or service to market? Is it going to be retail? Are you going to go through retail vendors? Are you going to offer the products and services directly to consumers? Are you going to do so through a network of partners? Right. So all of these are questions about where the service is delivered. The third level, the third question you will ask is, how will we win? And by this, they mean the unique factors that will allow you to be competitive in those conditions. So what is our value proposition? Do we have any intellectual property that no one else has, right? Like there has to be something there that we can bring to bear towards actually achieving this winning aspiration. The fourth question is, what capabilities must be in place for us to be able to actually deploy those advantages towards winning in the marketplace. So this includes things like our specific configuration as a business. What activities do we need to have in place to reinforce these advantages? For example, if you have made a choice to sell your product through a partner network, you are going to need different capabilities in the organization than if you are going through a network of retail vendors. If you have decided that what you need to do is to invent a better widget, you're going to need research and development as a capability in the org. The final set of questions that they ask have to do with management systems. And that has to do with the actual structure of the organization and the incentives that you put in place to make it possible for all of these other factors to be actually brought to bear in the world. And the reason that they call it a cascade is that the decisions that you make at the top should influence the decisions lower down the chain here. So that if you decide on your winning aspiration, that is going to inform where you play, and where you play is going to inform how you win. How you win is going to, the aggregate of all of these things is going to inform what capabilities you need, and what capabilities you need in turn is going to inform what management structures need to be in place. And they make the point that this also flows back up, in that once you know what management systems are in place, you can then refine your capabilities, which leads you to refine your the ways that you're going to win, and so on further up the line. So this is the cascade of choices that they talk about. And they make the point in this book of saying that these choices are not limited to the organization as a whole, but they this cascade also plays out at the division level, and they also play out at the team level. So if you have a large organization like P&G, they're going to have a winning aspiration and so on and so forth for the organization as a whole. But PG is composed of a lot of different divisions that have their own winning aspirations, their own places where they aim to play, etc. And moreover, teams within those divisions have their own winning aspirations, etc. And they describe this as a matrix that informs the up and down various levels of the organization. So I find this a very useful framework for thinking about strategic choices. And what I want to do now is switch at this point to talking about where design comes in. Because I think that the way that most organizations approach this is by thinking that once all these decisions have been made, they will be handed over to maybe, they will inform what product organizations do, and those product organizations in turn will then work with designers to make those products real or those services real, as the case might be. And I believe that, like I said, design can offer more. We can bring more value to the equation. And we can do so by bridging strategy and implementation, and also by informing through the things that we create and put out into the world, informing the strategy. And I'm going to unpack that. I'm going to tell you about it by telling you about another model that comes from a completely different domain, but one that I find very insightful and very valuable. And a few of you might have seen this already, but for those of you who haven't, it's a very useful model that you should know about. And it's Stuart Brand's PACE layer model. And Stuart Brand is an American, I think the way to talk about him is like he's a polymath. He's someone who is interested in a lot of things, and that makes him very interesting. And among the many things that he has done and contributed to the world is this model called the PACE layer model of change. And this is a model that comes from the world of architecture. And it's a model for describing how things change over time. Remember that I said that businesses are dynamic and complex. And businesses are not the only dynamic and complex things in the world. Buildings are dynamic and complex. And you wouldn't think of a building as dynamic because they just kind of sit there most of the time, but buildings change over time. And societies are dynamic and complex. And this diagram that I have on the screen now from Brand's book, The Clock of the Long Now, is a diagram of how societies change over time. And what this diagram says is that societies aren't monolithic, and they don't change evenly. They are composed of different layers that change at different rates. And the layers at the bottom of the diagram change more slowly than the layers at the top. So you think about nature, our fundamental nature as human beings, our biology, for example, it takes a long time for that to change through the process of evolution. Culture is another layer, and that one changes faster than biology. So our cultures are very different than the cultures of people who lived 2000 years ago, right? Governance frameworks change even faster than culture. So if you think of something like the US Constitution, that that was written and ratified a little over 200 years ago, and there have been amendments made, but over that time. So 200 years is is a is a fairly long time when you think about a human lifetime, but it's not a hugely long time. Certainly not when compared to evolutionary processes. Infrastructure. So our governments create infrastructure, and that infrastructure sticks around. It changes. Commerce, right? So commerce changes even faster than infrastructure. And then ultimately, the last layer Brand calls fashion or art, and that means all these experiments that we make, these very fast-paced experiments, and you see the line they draw it as squiggly because it's always changing fashion, right? And this is a useful model because all these things are changing at different speeds. And the point that Brand makes in this book is that the topmost layers are the layers where societies get to experiment with new ideas. And the lower layers, things like culture and governance, are where the ideas that are deemed worthwhile are codified. So in some ways, you can think of this as the top layers are where a society learns, and the lower layers are where a society remembers. And this is a model that has been used for a lot of different purposes over time. And it's very useful in thinking about um, dynamic and complex challenges. And I have adapted Brand's model for UX work. And I'm going to share it with you because one of the purposes of this base layer model for UX work is to situate design within the ways in which organizations change. So as with the base layer model, my model has the slower moving layers at the bottom and the faster moving layers at the top. And I will start by drawing the top one because that's the one that pertains the design work. So the top layer is what I call form. And form, you can think of, it's a generic term. I picked a generic term intentionally because form can be anything from a user interface for a web-based application to something like a new car, all right? So these are the actual tangible things that we experience in the world. And immediately below that, we have a slower moving layer that I call structure. And structure, you can think of as information architecture. And that is the set of distinctions that organizations make through the careful use of language that inform things like how people experience our products and services. And the reason why I differentiate structure from form is that form is very fast changing, but structure tends to endure. So at this point in my career, I've been through many redesigns of websites and apps that are getting updated because user interface is subject to fashions, right? So a while back, we used to have these phones that had very this horrible word, skeuomorphic user interfaces, right? And all of a sudden, the world shifted to a different aesthetic that was more minimalistic. That was a change in aesthetic, but it wasn't a structural change. Many of the underlying distinctions of these systems remained, right? So it's important to think about structure as separate from form. These structures are often informed by governance frameworks. And by governance, I mean the policies and relationships within the organization and its industry that inform the structure. So if you are working in financial services, the things that you make are not a free-for-all. There are regulations that you have to abide by. If you are in an organization that has organized itself around a network of partners to bring your products to market, you are going to have certain governance frameworks and structures in place that are going to be different from those of an organization that sells directly to consumers. And all of those line this governance layer. The layer immediately below is the one that pertains our conversation today, strategy. And I've already told you a lot about what I think about strategy, so I'm not going to belabor that. But I will just say that that in turn rests atop an even slower moving layer, which I call purpose. And this is what the organization exists to do in the world. And I'll give you a very quick example of how this breaks down for an organization in the real world. So take Tesla. Tesla's stated purpose is to help accelerate the world's move to renewable energy. And the way that they've done that, the set of strategic choices that they've made include things like deciding to start by developing electric vehicles. Moreover, they had a strategic approach to how they developed those electric vehicles. So they started focusing on the electrical components as opposed to things like the chassis, which they initially outsourced, right? And they used the proceeds from the first product, which was a sports car with a very limited appeal. It wasn't a mass market product. They used the proceeds from that to create a luxury sedan, which then generated the revenues to develop products that have been broadening their appeal. Those are strategic choices, right? Another strategic choice Tesla has is very different from other car manufacturers in that they don't sell their products through a dealer network. They decided to sell directly through consumers through their own showrooms and online. And all of those choices lead to particular governance frameworks. And Tesla has to also abide by regulations in their industry, right? All of those figure into this governance layer. And all of those lower layers of management there inform the things like the structure of their website, for example. And that in turn is very different and that in turn informs the actual user interface of the website. And my point, and this is the main takeaway from this presentation, is that designers in most organizations are thought to be playing exclusively up here. And they're thought to be the people who put user interfaces on top of these things. And while that is certainly a big part of what design does, it is by no means the only thing that design can provide, the only value that design can provide. For one thing, these forms manifest structure, right? So they articulate decisions about the distinctions that we want to make in the world. So in the case of Tesla, the product lines establish distinctions between one product and another. And like I said, all of those layers in turn are influenced by the layers that they sit on top of. And the value that design can bring to the organization in this model has to do with the fact that due to the dynamic nature of business, especially in today's world where things are changing so quickly, design allows us to make experiments about what these structural distinctions can be. And it allows us to prototype new governance frameworks, which in turn allows us to get insights about strategic decisions. So thinking about design beyond just the form-making role, design can also be thought of as a kind of a sensing organ of the organization, whose purpose it is to make the possible tangible. And it's very different to conceptualize a problem using a spreadsheet than to conceptualize a problem by making a thing, putting it into the world, and seeing what kind of reception it gets. And I strongly believe that that is a role that, it's not that design can lead in that role, but that design can provide the people who are making those levels of decisions with the tools that they need to get insights that are informed by more than just abstractions, by actually making things in a relatively accessible, inexpensive way and trying them out. And like I said, with Stuart Brand's model, he talks about these experiments that happen in the fashion layer, and that the ones that make sense kind of percolate to the bottom and they get codified into strategy. So if you think about design as an organ that helps make these experiments, and you build the mechanisms for it to explicitly inform the layers that it sits on, all of a sudden you unlock all of this potential and value that design can bring to the organization. So I'm looking at my timer and realizing that we are at time. That is my main message for you. Hopefully it allows you to think a little bit differently about the value that design brings to the table. Again, we are much like the drill, right? Like we are not, design doesn't exist because organizations need a drill. And it doesn't even exist because the organization needs holes. It exists in the organization because the organization needs to find a way of hanging the paintings, right? And we should think about the role of design not just as drilling and hole making, and perhaps not even as hanging paintings, but also, should we be hanging paintings, and where, and if we should be doing it, where should we be hanging them, right? And these are much more, I'm stretching this analogy thin here, but these are much deeper questions than the ones that design is usually involved in. And I believe that by asking such questions and asking why, when we are tasked with a design role, and doing so respectfully and constructively, we can help unlock a lot more value for our organizations. All right, so that is what I have for you today, and I'm hoping that you all have questions. I can't see the questions, so I'm now turning it over to see if
Awesome.
there are any.
Cool. Thanks so much, Jorge. That was super interesting, and my brain hurts a bit now after that. We've got a few questions come in. First one from David, who says, "Thank you, Jorge. Very interesting webinar. You mentioned some books on strategic design, but are there any courses you recommend that can expand your knowledge further?
Well, to be clear, the books that I was talking about are not books about strategic design. They're books about design, about strategy, about business strategy. And I just want to make a little pitch here for a book about strategic design that I did not mention during the talk, but which I like a lot. And it's called Dark Matter and Trojan Horses by Dan Hill. And the subtitle of that book is A Strategic Design Vocabulary. And it teaches, as it says in the title, it teaches you a new set of distinctions and a new language for thinking about design more strategically. I don't know of any courses myself. That doesn't mean that they don't exist, that are specifically about design and strategy. That said, I do know that there are courses about strategy itself, and they're worth checking out. I know that there is one, there's an introductory course in LinkedIn Learning that might be worth looking into. Yeah, but I will. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. So if I find any that are worth sharing, I will do so over social media.
Awesome, thank you very much. So yeah, we have another question from anonymous. Where and how can design excel in the strategy and governance level?
Where and how can design excel at the strategy level? All right.
Yeah, strategy and governance level.
Strategy and governance. All right, hold on. Let me let me switch my screen here. Right. So I'm switching my screen here because I have a few more things to say about this. So in general, and not just about strategy and governance, in general, I believe that designers bring a set of abilities to the team. So if you think of the organization as a collection of abilities, you know, or teams with different abilities. So the compliance department are experts in interpreting the law and figuring out how we can play within the rules to the best of our abilities and to maximize our potential, right? And the marketing is about defining the things like the product messaging. So what are the assets that design brings to the table? What are the skills? So there's four that I think that are essential. So one is, like I said at the tail end of the conversation, one is the ability to ask why, right? So, and this is one that we don't practice enough, frankly. This notion that we get asked to do something and we just immediately jump to execute it. We do have the ability to ask why. Like I said, it has to be done respectfully and constructively. But I find that oftentimes when a product organization, for example, or a marketing organization comes to the design team with a program for some project that they want done, they will have formulated the request in such a way that it comes with with like the germs of the answers already baked in, and there are a lot of assumptions there. And oftentimes those assumptions are not derived from research. And one of the advantages that design has is that design has the ability and the skill set to go do research in the world. Like we start projects by trying to understand who the people are that are going to be using the thing that we're working on. We try to understand the language they use. We try to understand the mental models that people have, and the content that informs those mental models, right? And I think that we have the ability and the wherewithal to unpack these requests by digging deeper and asking why. So that's one thing. Another is designers, whether they know it or not, are systems thinkers. And just to be kind of clear and do it at a high level, by that I mean we have the ability to identify the components of a solution and how they relate with each other towards achieving particular goals. And we have particular skills in not just thinking in terms of systems, but also articulating those things, which are, and which brings me to the third point here, which is that designers have the ability to think long term. And this is something that is surprisingly challenging when you are in a business context that is pushing for um, quarterly goals, for example. I think that by deploying our systems thinking skills, designers uh, are better suited than many other parts of the organization to think about second and third order effects. So what is likely to happen if we do this thing here? Um, I hear that sort of discussion happening fairly often within design organizations, and it's and this is the sort of thing that stakeholders need when they're making business decisions that operate at the strategic level. And the final thing that I'll say, and I think that this is one of the most important, is that designers have the ability to think abstractly. This is not just to think abstractly, but to articulate their thinking clearly. And by this, I mean the ability to draw a map of concepts, for example, to create a framework, a visual framework. Think of something like a journey map. I've been in workshops with business stakeholders where we've drawn a journey map. And it is such an incredibly powerful artifact to bring to bear to these folks who are frankly used to working in tools like Excel. When you can all of a sudden step back and understand something like the way that the relationship of a customer changes with your product over time, and to see it visually in a way that can be that you can point to and talk about, that changes the level of the conversation. And that's a superpower that designers have. So those are four ways that I think that we can bring our abilities to bear in the strategy and governance layers. Now, whether we get invited to do those things with those teams and those stakeholders, that depends on our ability to lead, right? And that's the challenge ahead of us. I hope I've answered that. I realize that we are at time, so I don't want to belabor this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Christian also had a very similar question, but I think you've just answered that there with your very good answer. And finally, Sarah or Sarah, sorry if I've got that wrong. Which tools can I use to develop my product or services strategy?
What tools? I don't think that this is the sort of thing where I can point you to like a software tool, but there are a lot of frameworks. If you're willing to think about a framework as a tool, and I do, something like the Lafley and Martin framework that I was talking about earlier is super useful. There's another one that I didn't have time to show you all today. Michael Porter's 5 forces diagram. If you want to Google that, that's a very powerful framework for thinking, and frankly it's a visual thing. Like it's a diagram that you can look at. And I consider all of those to be tools that that can help us not just think more strategically, but also help stakeholders visualize their strategic decisions.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. We have lots of people in the chat saying thank you very much and how much they've enjoyed the talk. Thank you. Yeah, thank you to you, Jorge. Thank you to everyone watching. We'll be back tomorrow with 3 more talks from Peter Bersma, John Belanger, and Andrew Hinton. Yeah, I'm sure if anyone has any more questions, they can get in touch with you on Twitter or LinkedIn or something, Jorge, I'm sure.
It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Cheers.